The winter of 1809 did not arrive with a gentle frost, but with a predatory chill that seeped through the limestone walls of the cottage at the edge of the Sterling estate. Elara Catherine Vance had learned how to render herself entirely invisible. It was the way the light avoided the corners of her small parlour, and how the villagers turned their gazes whenever her carriage, no longer bearing the ducal crest, passed them by. She sat by a hearth that offered more smoke than heat, her hands resting instinctively over the heavy, rhythmic curve of her stomach. Inside her, a life stirred, unaware that the world outside was being systematically dismantled by a woman with a quill and a heart of flint. The door did not groan on its hinges so much as it surrendered to the sudden intrusion of Lady Honoria Beatrice Sterling. She entered the room like a draught of mountain air, expensive, biting, and entirely unwelcome. Honoria did not wait for an invitation to sit. She simply stood in the center of the rug, her velvet pelisse trimmed in silver fox fur shimmering under the dim tallow candle. The scent she carried was not of the earth or the season, but of imported jasmine and the clinical sharpness of a woman who viewed emotions as a ledger to be balanced. "Arthur is at the front," Elara whispered, her voice like dry parchment. She did not rise, for her body was heavy with the 8th month of her secret burden, and her pride was the only thing keeping her spine straight against the wooden chair. "Arthur promised he would return by the spring. He wrote to me from the peninsula. He said the war could not keep him from his wife." The word wife hung in the stagnant air, a fragile thing that Honoria proceeded to crush with a single sharp exhale. "Arthur James Sterling is a duke of the realm, and you are a lapse in his judgment," Honoria replied, her tone as polished as a dueling pistol. She reached into her reticule and produced a single sheet of heavy vellum. "The Sterling legacy is a cathedral, Elara. It is built on stone and bloodline, not on the fleeting fancies of a village girl who happens to have a talent for mending old books. Arthur was wounded in the peninsula. He is not dead, but he is altered. He realizes now that a marriage conducted in a forest chapel, witnessed by a drunkard and a blind clerk, is a ghost that must be laid to rest." Elara felt a sudden, sharp kick against her ribs, a small, indignant protest from the child who did not yet have a name. "It is a legal marriage, Honoria. We have the certificate. We have the letters. Arthur loves me. He would not send you here to do this." It was not love that Honoria displayed, but a calculated form of mercy that felt indistinguishable from an execution. She laid the vellum on the scarred oak table, alongside a silver inkwell and a fresh quill. "You will sign this renunciation. You will state that the ceremony was a fabrication, a youthful folly. In exchange, an annuity will be settled upon you in a distant county, enough to ensure you never have to work a day in your life, provided you vanish from this map entirely. If you refuse, I will ensure that the child you carry is born in a debtor's prison. I will see to it that every letter Arthur ever wrote you is burned as evidence of your own delusion. You will be a phantom, Elara, and Arthur, he will be told that you took a lover and fled the country when you heard of his injury." The silence that followed was a physical weight, the exact temperature of a life being erased. Elara looked at the quill. She thought of Arthur's hands, which were usually stained with ink or horsehair, and the way he had looked at her in the library as if she were the only thing in the world that made sense to him. But she also saw the coldness of the room, the lack of firewood, and the reality of a woman who held the keys to every door in England. Honoria was not a person. She was the personification of a class hierarchy that did not permit the invisible to become visible. "My son will be a Sterling," Elara murmured, her fingers trembling as they touched the edge of the vellum. "Your son will be a Vance," Honoria corrected, her voice dropping to a whisper that mimicked the hiss of the dying fire. "He will be a healthy Vance with a roof over his head and a full belly, or he will be a nameless corpse in a workhouse ward. The choice is yours. Arthur is gone, Elara. The war took the man you knew, and the Duke who remains has no room for a seamstress's daughter." With a heart that felt as though it were being bound in iron wire, Elara reached for the pen. The scratch of the quill against the vellum was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a legacy being severed, of a truth being bartered for survival. When the ink dried, Honoria took the paper with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She left a small purse of coins on the table, the first payment for a lifetime of silence, and stepped back out into the winter, her carriage wheels crunching over the frost like the breaking of bones. Elara sat in the dark, her hands once again finding the curve of her belly, listening for the water of the nearby stream, not the wheel of the world that had just crushed her. 6 years passed with the slow, agonizing rhythm of a mending needle, The Regency era had matured into a period of opulent decay. But for Elara and the boy who shared her quiet exile, the world remained a narrow place of grey wool and thin soup. They lived in a rented room above a cobbler's shop in a town 3 days' journey from the Sterling lands. Elara had survived by her wits and her hands, binding ledgers for local merchants and taking in the fine embroidery that the wealthy were too impatient to do themselves. She had become a master of absolute obscurity, a shadow in the marketplace, a ghost in the parish register. Leo Thomas Vance was a child of the edges. At 5 years old, he possessed a stillness that was unnerving in one so young. He did not run or shout, he watched. He had his father's silver-grey eyes, a shade of flint and stormy Atlantic water, and a habit of tilting his head when he listened to the wind, as if he were waiting for a voice he had heard in a dream. He was a beautiful child, but hunger is a sculptor that leaves hollows beneath the cheekbones, and the winter of 1815 was a particularly cruel artist. The cobbler's shop was cold, the kind of cold that lived in the marrow. Elara watched Leo as he sat on a stool, carefully sorting scraps of leather into piles. He did it with an intensity that made her heart ache, the same precision she used to see in Arthur when he was cataloguing his grandfather's coins. They were out of coal. The small annuity Honoria had promised had arrived irregularly, then ceased altogether 2 years prior, leaving them in a state of precarious penury. "Mother," Leo said, his voice small but steady, "are we going to the great house today?" Elara paused, her needle mid-air. She had heard a rumor in the market that the housekeeper of Blackwood Manor, Mrs. Gable, was looking for temporary help. A great victory had been won at Waterloo, and the nobility were returning to their estates to celebrate, to feast and to forget the blood in the mud of Flanders. The Sterling estate was miles away, but Mrs. Gable was currently residing at the family's northern hunting lodge, a sprawling, draughty manor known as Blackwood, to prepare for the Duke's long-awaited return. "We are going to find work, Leo," Elara replied. Her voice soft but firm. It was a risk, a terrifying, jagged risk. But the alternative was the workhouse. She had changed her hair, her name, and the very way she carried herself. To the world, she was Mrs. Vance, a widow of modest means and high competence. She hoped that 6 years of grief and labor had altered her face enough to hide the girl she once was. The journey to Blackwood was a blur of damp wool and aching feet. When they arrived at the servants' entrance, the manor loomed over them like a sleeping beast. It was a place of limestone and history, its windows reflecting the bruised purple of the winter twilight. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was a map of stern kindness, received them in the stone-flagged kitchen. The air there was thick with the scent of roasting pheasant rosemary and the heavy, sweet aroma of plum pudding, smells that made Leo's stomach let out a treacherous, audible growl. "I need a clerk who can read a ledger and a seamstress who doesn't have thumbs for fingers," Mrs. Gable said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Elara's calloused but elegant hands. "The Duke returns in 3 days. The accounts are a shambles, and the linens haven't been turned since the war began. You say you can do both?" "I can," Elara said, her spine straight. "I have my own tools. I require a room with a hearth for the boy, and a fair wage. I do not gossip, and I do not idle." Mrs. Gable looked at Leo, who was staring at a cold plate of leftovers sitting on a nearby side table. The boy had the sterling eyes, but in the flickering candlelight of a kitchen, many children had grey eyes. It was his stillness that caught the housekeeper's attention. "He is a quiet one," she remarked. "He is observant," Elara replied, placing a protective hand on Leo's shoulder. "He will not be a hindrance. He can sort parchment and keep the fires." "Very well," Mrs. Gable sighed, handing Elara a heavy iron key. "You'll start in the library. It's the only room the Duke cares for." "He's a cold man now, Mrs. Vance. They say the war didn't just scar his face. It froze his blood. You stay out of his sight and you keep that boy away from the main hall. If he's seen, it's the road for both of you." Elara nodded, the weight of the key cold in her palm. She led Leo through the back corridors, past the copper pans and the frantic activity of the scullery maids. As they ascended the narrow servant stairs, she felt the ghosts of her past pressing in on her. She was back in the belly of the beast, hiding in the shadows of a house that should have been her home. She looked down at Leo, whose small hand was gripped tightly in hers. "Tonight we eat," she whispered to him as they entered a tiny attic room. Leo looked at the small window that overlooked the grand driveway. He didn't ask about the food. He simply watched the first carriage of the evening pull up to the front steps, a black lacquered gig with silver lanterns. The boy didn't know he was looking at the man whose blood ran in his veins. He only knew that the house felt like a cage. and the air smelled of things he was never meant to taste. Elara watched the candle flame flicker in the draught, the light catching the silver thread she had kept hidden in her pocket. The only thing she had left from her wedding dress. She extinguished the flame with a steady breath, leaving them in the heavy, breathless quiet that precedes a storm. The black lacquered gig did not merely arrive. It imposed itself upon the gravel of Blackwood Manor, the silver lanterns cutting through the mist like the eyes of a spectral predator. The horses, lathered in sweat despite the freezing air, tossed their heads, their breath blooming in the dark like sudden white flowers. Arthur James Sterling stepped from the carriage before the groom could reach the door, his movements possessing a heavy, jarring rhythm that spoke of a body that had endured more than the passage of seasons. He was a man carved from the very limestone of his estate, sharp-edged, grey, and weathered by a silence that no ballroom music could ever hope to thaw. The front doors of the manor swung open, releasing a sudden rectangle of amber light that spilled across the frost-covered steps. Mrs. Martha Gable stood in the center of the threshold, her hands clasped over her apron in a gesture that was as much a defensive wall as it was a mark of respect. She watched the man she had once known as a vibrant, impulsive youth walk toward her, but the figure that emerged from the shadows was a stranger. The war had taken the light from his eyes and replaced it with the clinical, unblinking gaze of a man who had seen the bones of the world and found them wanting. A jagged scar, the color of a faded bruise, traced a line from his temple to the edge of his jaw, a permanent reminder of the day Salamanca had tried to claim him. "Welcome home, Arthur," the housekeeper murmured, her voice steady despite the cold draft that rushed into the hall. The words were a formality, a thin bridge thrown across a chasm of 6 missing years. The Duke did not answer immediately. He stopped in the center of the foyer, his gaze traveling upward to the vaulted ceiling, where the shadows of the past seemed to huddle in the corners. The air here was different from the air of the peninsula. It smelled of beeswax, old damp, and the faint, lingering scent of lavender. It was a suffocating sort of peace. He unbuttoned his greatcoat, the heavy wool stiff with the salt and grime of the Channel crossing, and handed it to a waiting footman without a word. "Lord Julian Thorne is already in the drawing room, I assume?" Arthur asked, his voice a low rasp that sounded like gravel grinding against stone. "I saw his carriage in the stables. He always did have a penchant for outrunning my horses." "His lordship arrived an hour ago, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable replied, watching as Arthur moved toward the grand staircase. "He is currently making use of your brandy and the warmth of the gallery." The Duke paused, his hand resting on the heavy mahogany banister. He did not turn to look at her, but his profile was etched clearly against the flickering candlelight. "Mrs. Gable, see that a fire is lit in the library. I find the cold of this house has a particular way of settling in the marrow. And tell me, I thought I made it clear that I wanted no strangers in this house during my return. My sister, Lady Honoria Sterling, assured me that the estate was being managed with the utmost discretion." Mrs. Martha Gable's expression remained a mask of professional neutrality. "The accounts were neglected, Arthur. The Vance ledger, which the temporary clerk is currently compiling, already suggests that much has been overlooked. The woman, a Mrs. Vance, is quite competent. She works with a precision that I have rarely seen. She and her young son are confined to the attic quarters and the library. You will not be troubled by them." The Duke's eyes narrowed at the name, Vance. It was not merely a name. It was a sudden, sharp intake of breath he had to disguise as a heavy exhale. It felt like a shard of ice lodged in his throat, a phantom pain from a limb, long since lost to the surgical sores of memory. It brought back the grey morning of 1809 and the silence of the woman who had walked away without looking back. He dismissively waved a hand, forcing the ghost of Elara Catherine Vance back into the shadows. "As long as she is invisible, I do not care if she is a saint or a ghost," the Duke said. "See that the pheasant and some winter greens are served in the gallery. I want no fuss, Mrs. Gable. Just enough wine to ensure I do not have to listen to the silence of this tomb." He turned and ascended the stairs, his limp slightly more pronounced as he vanished into the upper gloom. The house had its master back, but it was a master who brought the frost of the battlefield with him. 2 floors above, in the cramped stillness of the attic room, Leo Thomas Vance sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his knees pulled up to his chest. The room was so small that he could touch both walls if stretched out. His arms and the window was nothing more than a slit in the stone that allowed the winter wind to whistle a mournful tune. He could hear the muffled sounds of the house below, the rhythmic vibration of the heavy carriage departing, and the faint, ghost-like aroma of roasting meat that had drifted up through the floorboards. His stomach felt like a hollow vessel, echoing with a hunger that was a constant, gnawing companion. His mother, Elara Catherine Vance, was downstairs in the library, her quill scratching against the vellum of the estate records, her spine surely aching from the hours spent bent over the scarred oak table. She had told him to stay put, to remain completely unnoticed, but the scent of the pheasant was a physical pull, a golden thread that promised a warmth he could not remember. He stood up, his movements as fluid and silent as a shadow. He wore a simple tunic of grey wool, patched at the elbows but clean, and his feet were bare to avoid the creak of the floorboards. He opened the attic door just a crack, listening for the shifts in the household's rhythm. The servants were busy in the scullery. The Duke was in his rooms. The halls were a wilderness of velvet and darkness. Leo Thomas Vance slipped out. He descended the servants' stairs with the practiced grace of a child who had lived his entire life on the periphery of things. When he reached the first floor, the scale of the world changed. The ceilings soared upward into the gloom, and the walls were lined with portraits of men and women who looked down at him with cold, painted eyes. He stopped before one particularly large canvas, a man with silver-grey eyes and a proud, stubborn chin, wearing a uniform that shimmered with gold lace. The boy tilted his head, a strange sense of recognition stirring in his chest, though he had never seen the painting before. The scent was stronger here, a heavy, rich fragrance of herbs and fat. He followed it through a set of double doors leading into the main gallery. The floor here was covered in a rug so thick it felt like walking on moss, and the air was warm from a nearby hearth. He was so focused on the sliver of light coming from the dining room that he did not hear the soft clink of a glass. "Arthur, is that you lurking in the dark like a gargoyle? You really must try the brandy. It has a far more sociable temperament than this drafty mausoleum." A voice rang out, rich with a dry melodic wit. Julian Thorne, the Earl of Thorne and the Duke's oldest friend, stepped into a pool of moonlight that fell through the high clerestory windows. He was dressed in the height of London fashion, his cravat tied with an intricate precision, and he held a crystal decanter of brandy in one hand. He paused, his head cocked to the side, his eyes scanning the gallery with a sharp, intelligent curiosity. "I could have sworn I saw a ghost," Lord Julian Thorne murmured to the empty air, "a very small ghost with a penchant for wandering." Leo held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Through the gap in the curtains he could see the Earl clearly. The man looked like he spent his nights drinking wine, yet there was a sharpness to his gaze that suggested he saw far more than he let on. Julian took a slow sip of the brandy, his gaze lingering on the curtain where Leo was hidden. He didn't move toward the boy, nor did he call for the guards. Instead, he simply smiled. A small, enigmatic curve of the lips that suggested he enjoyed the architecture of a good secret. "The silence in this house is getting to me," Julian Thorne said, speaking more to himself than to the shadows. "It is the kind of quiet that feels as though it is waiting for a scream or a song, cold enough to make a man think he is seeing things that are not there." He turned on his heel and began to walk toward the library, the soft thud of his boots receding into the distance. Leo Thomas Vance waited until the sound had completely vanished before he dared to move. He was trembling, not from the cold, but from the realization of how close he had come to being seen. To be seen was to be cast out. To be seen was to lose the only roof they had. But the hunger was still there, a fierce, unrelenting demand. He crept toward the dining room door, peering through the crack. Inside, a long table was set with silver that gleamed like moonlight on water. In the center, a single plate had been left. The leftover pheasant, its skin glazed with honey and thyme, surrounded by a crown of winter greens. It was a king's meal, abandoned and forgotten in the vast, empty room. Leo watched it for a long time, his eyes wide, his small hands gripping the edge of the doorframe. He thought of his mother's tired face and the way she had looked at the silver thread in the attic. He thought of the meticulously guarded silence of their lives. The boy didn't know that the man who had left that plate was Arthur James Sterling, sitting only a few rooms away, staring into a fire and trying to remember the sound of a voice he had buried in the mud of Spain. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he was looking at something that promised to fill the hollowness inside him. He retreated into the shadows, a ghost in his father's house, waiting for the perfect degree of stillness that would allow him to reach for what he needed. Arthur James Sterling sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table, a lone figure enveloped by the oppressive grandeur of a room that had not hosted a joyous meal in over a decade. The table was a river of polished wood, stretching out into the gloom, where the flickering light of the candelabra failed to reach the far corners. The silver cutlery lay beside a slice plate with a clinical predatory gleam, and the crystal wineglass held a deep, blood-colored Bordeaux that he had not yet touched. In the center of the vast expanse sat the leftover pheasant, its skin still glistening with a cooling honey glaze and the woody scent of thyme, but to the Duke, it looked less like food and more like a trophy of a life he no longer recognized. He picked up his fork, the heavy silver cold against his calloused palm, but the weight of it felt insurmountable. His hands, which had gripped the reins of chargers and the hilts of sabers amidst the smoke of the peninsula, now felt clumsy in the quietude of his own home. The silence of Blackwood Manor was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating shroud that seemed to absorb the very heat from the fire crackling in the hearth. Arthur found himself listening for the ghosts of his past, for the rhythmic scratch of a quill from the library or the soft, melodic hum of a voice that had once filled the gaps between the heartbeats of this house. Instead, he heard only the wind rattling the heavy sash windows and the settling of the old stones. He stared at the pheasant, but his mind was occupied by the name Mrs. Gable had mentioned, Vance. It was a common enough name, yet it felt like a deliberate puncture in his carefully constructed armor. He had spent 6 years trying to bury the memory of Elara Catherine Vance in the mass graves of his memory, only for her ghost to be conjured by the presence of a clerk in his attic. He set the fork down, the sharp clink against the china, sounding like a gunshot in the still air. From the deep velvet shadows of the heavy window curtains, a small pale face emerged. Leo Thomas Vance did not make a sound as he stepped into the pool of amber light spilling from the table's edge. He moved with a cautious, feline grace, his bare feet making no impression on the thick, dark-piled carpet. His tunic of grey wool was slightly frayed at the collar, but his posture was remarkably straight, echoing a dignity that seemed misplaced in a child of his station. The boy stopped 3 paces from the chair, his gaze fixed not on the formidable man at the head of the table, but on the cooling bird. He was so small that his chin barely cleared the edge of the mahogany, yet his presence was so absolute that Arthur felt the air in the room shift. The Duke did not move. He simply watched the boy, his grey eyes that had remained steady through the most brutal campaigns of the war, now widening with a shock that felt like a physical blow to the chest. The boy had the sterling brow. He had the sterling jaw, firm and slightly stubborn even in its youth, but it was the eyes that froze the blood in Arthur's veins. The exact shade of stormy Atlantic water, framed by long, dark lashes that were the mirror image of the reflection he saw every morning in his shaving glass. For a moment, the Duke wondered if the brandy had finally taken its toll, or if the madness of the conflict had followed him home across the sea. He opened his mouth to speak, to call for a servant, to demand an explanation for this small intruder who looked like a miniature version of his own soul, but his voice was caught in the dry hollow of his throat. He remained a statue of limestone and silver, caught in the profound, breathless hush that exists between a question and its answer. "May I eat what you didn't finish?" Leo asked, his voice steady and remarkably clear. It was not the voice of a beggar, nor was it the desperate whimper of a starving urchin. It was a request born of a simple, logical observation of waste. He looked up at Arthur James Sterling, meeting the Duke's piercing gaze with a disarming honesty that bypassed every social protocol and class barrier of the era. The boy's stomach let out a low, traitorous growl, a sound that seemed to shatter the tension in the room. He did not flinch or look away. He simply waited for the master of the house to grant him permission to claim what was clearly being abandoned. Arthur felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom in the frozen center of his chest. It was a protective instinct, a visceral pull that he could not name and dared not acknowledge. He looked at the leftover pheasant, then back at the boy who possessed his own eyes. The child's hunger was a physical weight in the room, more real than the titles, the land, or the scars he carried. Slowly, with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, the Duke pushed the silver plate across the vast mahogany expanse until it came to rest directly in front of the boy. He did not say a word. He could not. He only watched as Leo reached out a small, hesitant hand to touch the edge of the silver, the child's fingers surprisingly delicate against the heavy metal. Across the manor, in the high, vaulted silence of the library, Elara Catherine Vance felt a sudden cold dread wash over her that had nothing to do with the winter draft. She had been bent over the Vance ledger for hours, her fingers stained with the black ink of the manor's neglected history and the dusty scent of old parchment. The library was a room of shadows and cedarwood, filled with the collective knowledge of generations, but it felt like a tomb tonight. She had reached for a piece of blotting paper, her mind occupied by a discrepancy in the grain accounts from 1812, when she realized the absolute stillness of the room was wrong. Leo was no longer sitting on the floor by her feet, sorting the loose vellum scraps as she had instructed him. The small, rhythmic sound of his breathing, which usually served as her anchor, was gone. She stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the limestone floor, the sound echoing like a scream through the quiet corridors of the wing. "Leo," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. She looked behind the heavy velvet curtains and under the massive oak desk, but the boy was nowhere to be found. A frantic heat began to pulse behind her eyes. She knew the layout of this house. She knew how dangerous it was for a child of her station to be seen in the hallowed halls of the nobility. If Mrs. Gable found him, they would be dismissed. If Lady Honoria was already here, they would be ruined. But more than the fear of discovery was the primal terror of a mother, who knew her son's hunger was a force of nature that respected no boundaries. She fled the library, her simple dress of dark linen rustling against the cold walls as she navigated the passages. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She moved past the scullery, where the smell of damp stone and lye was thick, and toward the main body of the house. She should not be here. She was a ghost, a temporary worker, a woman who had been coerced into signing away her right to exist in the Sterling lineage. But as she approached the dining room, the scent of rosemary and roasted meat grew stronger, and with it, and the certainty of where Leo had gone. She stopped at the double doors of the dining hall, her hand hovering over the heavy brass handle. The air here was different. It smelled of expensive tobacco and the cold, clinical sharpness of the Duke's presence. She pushed the door open, the hinges moving with a slow, agonizing deliberation. The room was a cavern of gold and shadow, and for a moment she was blinded by the light of the central chandelier. Then her vision cleared, and the world seemed to stop its rotation. There, at the far end of the table, sat the Duke. Arthur James Sterling was exactly as she remembered him, yet entirely different. He was broader, harder, the lines of his face carved with a bitterness that made her soul ache. The jagged scar across his jaw was a testament to the years she had missed, the years she had spent in the grey exile of poverty, while he fought for the crown. But she did not look at him for long, for her gaze was immediately pulled to the small figure standing at his right hand. Leo was eating. He held a piece of the pheasant in his hand, his movements careful and dignified even in his hunger. He was standing so close to the Duke that their shadows merged into one long, dark shape on the heavy carpet. The sight of them together, the father who did not know he had a son, and the son who did not know he was the rightful heir, was a beauty so painful that Elara felt her knees begin to give way. She clutched the edge of the door frame, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She had spent 6 years building a wall of silence around her life, and in a single moment of a child's hunger, that wall had been reduced to dust. Arthur turned his head toward the door, his gaze locking onto hers with the precision of a hawk. The grey eyes that had looked at the boy with such confusion now narrowed as they fell upon the woman in the threshold. He did not recognize her immediately. The shadows and the years had been unkind to the girl he had loved in the forest chapel. But as she stepped into the light, the way she held her head, the quiet resilience in her spine, and the exact shape of her grief began to pull at the roots of his memory. The air between them became a bridge of unspoken truths, a high-tension wire that vibrated with the ghosts of 1809. "Leo," Elara finally managed to choke out, her voice a fractured thing that shattered the silence of the room. "Come here this instant." The boy looked up, his face smeared with a trace of honey glaze, his eyes wide with the realization that he had broken the cardinal rule of their survival. He did not run, however. He looked at the Duke, then at his mother, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the room's atmosphere. Arthur James Sterling did not stand. He remained in his chair, his hands gripping the mahogany arms so tightly that the wood seemed to groan under the pressure. He looked from the woman to the boy, and finally, since his return to English soil, the coldness in his blood began to thaw, replaced by a searing, indignant fire of recognition. He realized then that the Vance ledger was not the only thing being restored in his house. The bones of his own life were being laid bare, and the woman who held the quill was the only person who could tell him why his own eyes were looking back at him. from the face of a child. Such moments often mirror the silent halls in any life where a truth waits to be spoken, much like the heavy winter frost finally settling on the stones of Blackwood Manor. The silence that followed Elara Catherine Vance's command was a pressurized vessel, heavy with 6 years of unspoken grief and the metallic tang of an old betrayal. Arthur James Sterling did not rise immediately. Instead, his presence seemed to expand, filling every shadowed corner of the dining hall, as he traced the lines of her face with a desperate, clinical intensity. She was thinner than the girl he had loved, her softness replaced by a structural resilience that reminded him of the ancient oaks on the estate, scarred by storms but unyielding. Her hands, once as smooth as sarsenet, were visible against the dark wood of the doorframe, the skin raw from the labor of mending and the biting winter cold. Leo Thomas Vance remained a small, grey-clad anchor between two colliding worlds. He looked at the Duke, then at the woman whose voice carried a vibration of pure, unadulterated fear. Near the silver plate of the leftover pheasant, the boy's hand rested with a stillness that was unnervingly familiar. In the amber light, the resemblance was no longer a suggestion. It was an indictment. The sterling brow, the stubborn set of the jaw, and the eyes that held the piercing chill of the winter sea. All of it was a mirror held up to the man in the mahogany chair. Arthur felt the jagged scar on his jaw throb, a phantom ache signaling a deeper wound opening within the marrow of his own history. "You are the clerk, Mrs. Gable," hired Arthur James Sterling said, his voice a low rasp that vibrated through the floorboards. He did not use her name, the name he had whispered in forest chapels and scrawled on blood-stained letters from the peninsula. To use it would be to admit the ghost had flesh, Mrs. Vance, the widow who specializes in the restoration of ruined ledgers. "I am, Your Grace," Elara replied, regaining a fraction of her professional poise. Her fingers remained white, knuckled against the doorframe, as she addressed him with the formal distance required of her station. She looked at the space just above his shoulder, a tactical maneuver to keep her heart from betraying her. "I apologize for the boy's intrusion. Hunger is a poor student of protocol. We shall return to the library and vacate the premises by dawn." "Vacate?" The Duke's voice dropped, the word sounding like a sentence passed in a military court. He stood, his tall frame casting a long, jagged shadow over the table. The limp in his stride was barely perceptible as he moved toward the center of the room. "The library is a shambles, and the accounts of this estate have been neglected for a decade. The Vance ledger is barely half finished. You have been paid in advance for your labor, have you not?" "The advance was for the survival of my son, not for the purchase of my soul," Elara whispered, the words slipping out before she could catch them. She felt the heat of his gaze, a physical pressure that made the air feel too thin to breathe. "The Sterling estate deals in contracts, not souls." Arthur countered, stopping 3 paces from her. He was close enough now that she could smell the tobacco and the faint scent of cedar that had always clung to him. He looked down at Leo, who was watching the exchange with profound stillness. "The boy has eaten from my table. By the laws of this house, that creates a debt of service. You will stay, Mrs. Vance. You will stay until every book is mended and every figure in that ledger is balanced to the last farthing. I find I have an urgent interest in the bones of this estate, and I require a clerk who is not afraid of the truth." Elara looked into those silver-grey eyes and saw a man drowning in his own silence. He was using the Vance ledger as a leash, a way to keep her within reach without naming the reason why. She thought of the signed renunciation she had been forced to sign in 1809. The document likely hidden in Honoria Beatrice Sterling's cedarwood box, and the danger of remaining. Yet, she saw the hollows beneath Leo's cheekbones that only regular meals could fill. Her survival was once again being dictated by a Sterling, and once again she had no choice but to surrender. "Very well," she murmured, bowing her head to shield her eyes. "We shall stay until the accounts are mended. But the boy stays with me. He is not to be a fixture of your halls. He is already a fixture of this house, whether you acknowledge it or not," Arthur replied, gaze lingering on the child for a heartbeat too long. He turned back toward the table. "Mrs. Gable will move your quarters to the west wing, closer to the library. It is warmer there. I find I cannot think when the air in this manor is so brittle." As Elara led Leo from the hall, they passed a shadowed figure. Lord Julian Thornsome stood by a suit of armor, his dry wit silenced by the scene. He watched them pass, his keen eyes lingering on Leo's profile before shifting to the Duke. Julian knew the Sterling history better than most, and he sensed the foundations of Blackwood Manor beginning to shift. Mrs. Gable met them at the servants' stair, her face a mask of professional calm that could not hide her maternal concern. "This way, Mrs. Vance," the housekeeper murmured, carrying a flickering brass candlestick. "The west wing has been aired. I've seen to it that there is a fire and extra woolens for the boy." The new quarters were a sanctuary of amber light and the scent of dried lavender. While Leo fell into an exhausted sleep on a mattress of goosedown, Elara sat by the hearth. She pulled a small silk pouch from her stays, drawing out the silver thread. The shimmering line of history she kept as the only memento of a marriage the world claimed never happened. She held it against the firelight, the thread glowing like a promise, before tucking it away. Tomorrow, the labor of restoration would begin, and she would have to face the ghost of her past across the pages of the Vance ledger. The following morning, the sun struggled to pierce the mist clinging to the limestone walls of the library. Elara sat at the massive oak desk, her bone folder moving with rhythmic precision. To mend a book was to bring order to chaos, and she found sanctuary in the craft. She was currently working on the accounts from 1810, the year Leo was born, and her heart hammered as she saw how estate funds had been systematically diverted under the direction of Lady Honoria. The library door was thrust aside, the heavy panels striking the wall like thunder. Elara did not need to look up. The scent of jasmine and the atmosphere of high society cruelty preceded the woman. Lady Honoria Beatrice Sterling marched to the desk, her violet sarcenet gown rustling with aggressive energy. She stopped, her gaze raking over Elara's simple dress and ink-stained fingers. "I did not believe even Martha Gable would be so foolish as to bring a ghost into this house," Honoria said, her voice a polished blade of ice. She stood there, her silver fox mantle shimmering, her eyes narrowed with a hatred that had not dimmed in 6 years. "You were given an annuity to vanish, Elara. You were given a choice between exile and the destruction of your reputation. Why have you crawled back like a mendicant seeking scraps?" Elara set down her bone folder, her spine as straight as a ledger line. She had learned how to shrink into the shadows, but she also knew that silence could be a weapon. "The annuity ceased 2 years ago, my lady, and that choice was made under duress. I am here because the Duke required a clerk who can read the bones of this estate. It seems I am the only one who can see where the marrow has been picked clean." Honoria's face went pale. She leaned over the desk, her hands gripping the vellum pages. "You will leave this house within the hour. I will not have a seamstress's daughter poisoning the air my brother breathes. If you are still here by noon, I will call the magistrate and produce the signed renunciation. The proof that you are nothing but an adventuress who tried to trap a duke with a fabricated marriage. The magistrate might find the accounts of 1812 more interesting than a piece of coerced vellum." Elara replied, her voice steady as she tapped the Vance ledger. "The Sterling legacy is a cathedral, but it appears the foundations have been traded for jasmine oil and French silks. Do you really wish for Arthur to see these figures before I have mended them?" The silence between them carried the biting chill of a frozen lake. Honoria reached out, her fingers curling as if to shred the ledger, when a shadow fell across the threshold. "My sister always did have a dramatic flair for morning visits," Arthur James Sterling said, his voice coming with the suddenness of a mountain slide. He was dressed in a dark frock coat, his hair damp from the morning mist. He walked into the room, his gaze moving from Honoria's enraged face to Elara's watchful eyes. "I do not recall giving you permission to disrupt my staff. Mrs. Vance is under my personal protection. A history that has been poorly guarded in my absence is finally being restored." "Arthur, you cannot be serious," Honoria hissed, her voice shifting to manipulative concern. "This woman is a danger to the Sterling name. I found her attempting to blackmail us with falsified accounts. She must be removed for the sake of our bloodline." The Duke moved to the desk, his hand resting on the spine of the Vance ledger. He looked at Elara, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his regard was replaced by a searching, vulnerable heat. He turned to his sister, his jaw tightening. "The bloodline of this family is my concern, not yours. I am the Duke of Sterling. Mrs. Vance stays because she is competent, because she is honest, and because I have willed it. If you find Blackwood Manor too crowded, Honoria, you are welcome to return to London." Honoria looked at her brother, realizing her power was evaporating like mist. She shot a look of pure vengeance at Elara before sweeping from the room, the rustle of her gown, sounding like the dry hiss of a snake. The library returned to its meditative quiet. Arthur did not leave. He stood by the desk, his fingers tracing the edge of a moth-eaten page. He looked at Elara, who had picked up her quill, her hands trembling only slightly as she focused on the figures. "The boy," the Duke said, his voice directed at the rows of books. "He is sorting parchment in the back alcove." "He is," Elara replied, her voice a whisper. "He has your hands," Arthur murmured. A short, punchy affirmation that felt like a bridge across a chasm. "But he has the Sterling heart. I can see it in the way he looks at the world, as if he is already listening for the water, not the wheel." He turned and walked toward the back of the library, his limp echoing on the limestone floor. Elara sat in the ordinary light of the morning, no longer unseen, but witnessed in the clear light of her own truth. She picked up the quill, the scratch of the nib against the vellum the only sound, as she began the long painstaking labor of mending a life that had been broken for far too long. In every quiet house, there are neglected ledgers that need mending and hidden truths buried beneath the dust of years. Waiting for the precise moment, the silence begins to speak. The carriage wheels bearing Honoria Beatrice Sterling, away from Blackwood Manor, did not merely roll. They ground the frozen gravel into fine, bitter dust, the sound echoing through the foyer like the final, desperate gasp of a dying era. Arthur James Sterling stood by the heavy oak doors long after the sound had vanished into the grey shroud of the northern mist. His hands were clasped tightly behind his back, his posture as rigid as the limestone pillars that supported the grand portico. The air in the foyer was cold, the distinct chill of an estate that has forgotten how to be a home. And the faint scent of his sister's jasmine perfume lingered, a floral ghost that felt indistinguishable from a threat. Lord Julian Thorne watched his friend from the shadows of the gallery, his shoulders leaning against the dark panelling with a deceptive ease. Julian held a glass of untouched brandy, the amber liquid catching the pale winter light that struggled through the clerestory windows. He had spent his life observing the architectures of power and the fractures within the families who held it, and he knew that the silence currently vibrating between the walls was not a peace, but a suspension of hostilities. "You have always had a talent for the dramatic dismissal, Arthur," Julian said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that cut through the stillness without shattering it. He stepped into the foyer, his boots clicking softly on the marble floor. "Though I suspect Honoria will not find the air of the capital nearly as bracing as the truth she just left behind. She was never one to appreciate the clarity of a northern winter." The Duke did not turn. His gaze remained fixed on the empty driveway. "She was never a woman who cared for the truth, Julian. She cared for the ledger of our bloodline, for the preservation of a cathedral built on the bones of others. She sees the Sterling name as a fortress, and anyone who does not possess a deed to the gates is an invader. To her, people are either assets to be managed or liabilities to be erased." Julian moved closer, his gaze sharpening as he studied the profile of the man who had been his brother-in-arms. He saw the way Arthur's jaw was set, the white line of tension that mirrored the scar from Salamanca. "It is a peculiar thing, the way the world tries to hide what is written in the blood. I spent the morning watching that boy, Leo, in the library alcove. He was sorting vellum scraps with a precision that was unsettling in one so young. He did not ask for help, he did not seek approval. He simply worked, as if the labor itself were the only thing that made the world a solid place." Arthur finally turned, his silver-grey eyes narrowing in the dim light. "He is a child of the edges, Julian. Elara has taught him well the vital skill of evading notice. It is a survival instinct born of penury and the need to exist without attracting the notice of those who would do them harm." "Is it?" Julian Thorne tilted his head, his dry wit replaced by a clinical, searching gravity. He set his glass down on a side table, the crystal chiming softly against the wood. "I remember the summer of 1809, Arthur. I remember the forest chapel and the way you looked when you spoke of a girl who could mend a book better than a scholar could read one. I remember the timing of your departure for the peninsula and the letters that never received an answer." He paused, his gaze moving to the grand staircase. "The boy is 5, Arthur. He has the Sterling brow, the Sterling jaw, and a habit of tilting his head that I have seen in every Sterling portrait in this gallery for the last 3 generations. He did not learn that in a cobbler's shop, he was born with it." The Duke felt a sudden, visceral coldness in his marrow, a sensation far sharper than the winter draft. He wanted to dismiss Julian's words as the wanderings of a bored mind, yet he could still feel the phantom weight of the silver plate he had pushed toward Leo in the dining hall. He could still see the boy's eyes, his own eyes, meeting his with a disarming, terrifying honesty. "Honoria produced a signed renunciation," Arthur whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "She showed me the document 6 years ago. It stated that Elara had taken a lover and fled the country. It was signed in her own hand, or so it seemed at the time. I was in no state to question the world then, and you believed that a woman who risked everything for a forest wedding would suddenly find the bed of a stranger more appealing than the man she called husband. Julian asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that mimicked the hiss of the dying fire in the hearth. You were a duke with a shattered face and a broken soul, Arthur. Honoria knew that. She knew that the easiest way to kill a man's hope is to convince him that he was never truly seen. Look at the boy again. Not as a master looks at a servant, but as a man looks into a mirror. The Vance ledger is not the only thing that has been falsified in this house. Arthur did not answer. He turned and walked away, his limp sounding like a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat on the stone floor. He was not walking toward his study or the drawing room. He was moving toward the library, toward the scent of cedar and the scratch of a quill that had become the only sound he could trust in a house of lies. Inside the library, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the dry, intellectual aroma of old parchment. Elara Catherine Vance sat at the massive oak desk, her bone folder moving with a slow, meditative rhythm as she smoothed the crease of a ruined page. She was focused on the technicality of the task, the exact amount of pressure required to mend the fibers without bruising the vellum. Using the labor as a shield against the memory of Honoria's violet sarcenet gown and the predatory chill of her threats. She heard the doors open, but she did not look up. She knew the rhythm of his stride, the slight hesitation before each step that spoke of a wound that had never truly healed. The Duke did not stop at the threshold. He walked deep into the room, stopping only when he reached the edge of the desk. He stood there in silence, a tall, dark figure whose presence seemed to absorb the light from the nearby window. The accounts of 1810, Arthur said, his voice directed at the open ledger between her hands. You found a discrepancy. I did. Your Grace, Elara replied, her voice steady, despite the hammering of her heart. She looked at the column of figures, her quill hovering over a particularly egregious diversion of funds. It appears that a significant portion of the northern annuities was redirected to a private account in the south. The entries are coded, but the handwriting is consistent with the correspondence I found in the back of the 1809 files. Honoria's hand, Arthur murmured, though it was not a question. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The candlelight caught the silver grey of his eyes, making them look like polished steel. Why did you sign it, Elara? Why did you sign a renunciation that called our marriage a fabrication and our love a folly? The bone folder slipped from Elara's fingers, clattering against the limestone floor with a sound that felt like a bridge collapsing. She finally looked up, her gaze meeting his with a raw, unshielded intensity that she had spent 6 years trying to bury. The library, with its rows of silent witnesses and its atmosphere of learned peace, suddenly felt like a cage. I signed it because I was 19 and alone, she whispered, her voice, a fractured thing that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. I signed it because your sister stood in my cottage and told me that if I did not, the child I carried would be born in a debtor's prison. She told me that you were altered, that you were a duke of the realm who had no room for a village girl's delusion. She told me that every letter you ever wrote me would be burned as evidence of my own madness. Arthur felt the words strike him with the force of a physical blow. He thought of the letters he had written from the mud of Flanders, letters that had never reached their destination. He thought of the silence he had interpreted as betrayal. And the lover, the man she said you fled with? There was no lover, Arthur, Elara said, a single sharp exhale that was more a sob than a breath. There was only a rented room above a cobbler's shop and the precise shape of being unseen. I spent 6 years binding books and mending shoes to ensure that your son never had to know the inside of a workhouse. I stayed in the shadows because you were a man I no longer recognized, and I was a woman the world had decided did not exist. She reached into the pocket of her dark linen dress, her fingers trembling as they searched for something she had kept hidden against her skin for over 2,000 days. She pulled out a small, velvet-lined pouch and placed it on the desk between them. With a steady hand, she tipped the contents onto the vellum page of the Vance ledger. A ring tumbled out, not a grand piece of ducal jewelry, but a simple, heavy gold band with a single, unrefined sapphire set into the metal. It was the Sterling family ring, the one Arthur's father had given to his mother, and the one Arthur had placed on Elara's finger in a forest chapel witnessed by a drunkard and a blind clerk. It was the only bone of the thing that remained, the physical evidence of a truth that had been denied by everyone but the woman who had carried it in the dark. "I never sold it," Elara said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like the dry rustle of autumn leaves. "Even when we were out of coal, even when the soup was nothing but water and hope, I could not sell the only thing that proved I wasn't a phantom. I kept it to remind myself that once, for a single summer, I was more than a clerk and you were more than a duke." Arthur picked up the ring, the gold cold and heavy in his palm. He looked at it, then at the woman who had endured a life of penury and silence to protect the child who carried his eyes. He realized then that the scar on his jaw was nothing compared to the scars she carried. The internal, invisible fractures of a woman who had been systematically dismantled by the very family that should have been her sanctuary. "Honoria told me you were dead to me," he said, his voice breaking under the weight of a decade's worth of suppressed grief. "She told me the marriage was a mistake born of fever and the heat of the war. I believed her because it was easier to be cold than to wonder why the only person I ever loved had vanished without a word." He looked at the alcove where Leo was sitting, the boy's head tilted as he listened to the wind rattling the heavy sash windows. The child radiated the undeniable warmth of a hope he had long ago given up for dead. Arthur walked around the desk, his limp forgotten, and stopped inches from Elara. He did not reach out to touch her. The distance between them was still a chasm of 6 years, but the air was no longer brittle. It was warm, heavy with the scent of cedar, and the possibility of a restoration that went far deeper than the mending of old books. "You were never a phantom, Elara," he whispered, his silver-grey eyes searching hers. "You were the cornerstone of a house I forgot how to live in. And the boy, my son, will never have to ask for leftovers again. The Vance ledger is finished. From this moment on, we shall begin a new record, one that is written in the blood and the stone of this estate." Elara looked at him, and for the first time in 6 years, she did not look away. She saw the man she had loved in the forest chapel, hidden beneath the scars and the frost of the war. She picked up the quill, not to balance an account, but to set the bones of their life into a shape that could finally hold the weight of the light. Some truths remained tucked away in velvet pouches, waiting patiently for the destined moment of their reveal, much like the long, cold silence of Blackwood Manor finally beginning to break. The grand dining hall of Blackwood Manor was a cathedral of limestone and shadows, illuminated by the flickering, amber light of 100 beeswax candles that struggled to push back the encroaching winter gloom. It was a room designed for the display of power, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the silence of generations who had valued bloodline over the warmth of a human heart. Arthur James Sterling sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his tall frame silhouetted against the roaring fire in the hearth. To his right, Lady Honoria Beatrice Sterling sat with a rigid, icy grace, her violet sarcenet gown shimmering under the chandeliers like the skin of a poisonous fruit. She had not yet departed for the capital. She had stayed for one final evening, a desperate gambit to salvage the shards of her influence before the frost of her brother's silence became permanent. Across from her, Lord Julian Thorne watched the proceedings with a dry, observant gaze, his fingers idly tracing the rim of a crystal wine glass. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted venison, rosemary, and the sharp, clinical aroma of the Duke's preferred Bordeaux. It was a formal occasion, a grand dinner that felt more like a court-martial than a meal. In a move that had sent a shockwave through the scullery and the servants' quarters, Arthur had commanded that Elara Catherine Vance and the boy be present at the table. Elara sat beside Julian, her dark linen dress a stark contrast to the opulence of the room, her hands, still bearing the faint ink stains from the Vance ledger, resting quietly on the damask tablecloth. Beside her, Leo Thomas Vance sat on a chair that had been bolstered by leather cushions, his small face illuminated by the candlelight, his silver-grey eyes wide with a quiet, watchful intensity. Honoria did not look at Elara. To do so would be to acknowledge the existence of the ghost she had tried so hard to bury. Instead, she focused her venom on the child. She watched as Leo reached for a piece of bread, his movements possessing a feline grace that was at odds with the frayed edges of his tunic. The boy had been taught to render himself invisible, but in the light of the grand hall, his presence was a loud, undeniable resonance of the Sterling legacy. "It is a curious thing, Arthur," Honoria said, her voice a polished blade of ice that cut through the rhythmic clinking of the silver. She did not look at her brother, but kept her gaze fixed on the way Leo held his fork, a habit of survival that she interpreted as a beggar's lack of breeding. to bring a clerk's son to a table where the kings of England have once sat. The boy has an appetite that suggests he has spent more time foraging in the dirt than learning the protocols of a gentleman's house. I suppose one cannot expect a sow's ear to become a silk purse, no matter how much honey you pour over it. Leo paused, his fork mid-air. He looked at the woman in the violet dress, his stormy Atlantic eyes reflecting the candlelight with a terrifying adult-like clarity. He did not flinch, but the stillness that settled over him possessed the frigid depth of a winter sea. He looked at the plate of expensive game, then at the Duke, his mind surely drifting back to the dining room where he had once asked for the leftover pheasant. "Honoria," Arthur James Sterling said, his voice a low rasp that caused the crystal on the table to vibrate. He did not raise his voice, but the authority in it was absolute, a structural weight that seemed to flatten the very air in the room. He set his wineglass down, the base striking the wood with a decisive, hollow thud. "You speak of bloodlines and protocols as if they were walls built to keep the world out. You have spent your life mending the facade of this house, while the bones beneath were rotting from your own neglect. You look at this boy and see a beggar because you've forgotten how to look at anything with honesty." Honoria's face went a shade of pale that was indistinguishable from the limestone walls. "I speak for the Sterling name, Arthur. I speak for the preservation of our heritage." "The Sterling name is mine to command, not yours," the Duke countered, standing up from the mahogany chair. His tall frame cast a jagged, protective shadow over Leo. He turned to Julian Thorne, whose gaze was fixed on the boy, and then to the row of footmen standing by the sideboard. "Lord Julian, you have often wondered about the silence of this house. You have seen the ghosts that I have carried since the war. Tonight, those ghosts are laid to rest." Arthur moved to the side of the table, stopping beside Leo. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of such profound and sudden intimacy that Elara felt her breath catch in her throat. The Duke looked at the servants, his voice ringing out with the clarity of a church bell. "Let it be recorded in the ledgers of this estate and in the memory of every soul who serves within these walls," Arthur declared, his silver-grey eyes locking onto Honoria's with a searing, indignant fire. "This is not the son of a clerk. This is Leo Thomas Sterling. He is my son, my rightful heir, and the future Duke of this realm. From this moment on, he does not eat scraps and he does not live in the shadows. He is the cornerstone upon which the restoration of this family shall be built." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Elara had ever heard. It was the sound of a decade of lies being crushed beneath the weight of a single truth. Honoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if to catch the jasmine-scented breath that was escaping her. She looked at Leo, seeing for the first time the undeniable Sterling brow and the stubborn jaw that was a mirror image of the man standing beside him. Her gambit was over. The signed renunciation she had kept in her cedarwood box was now nothing more than a piece of ruined vellum as worthless as the cold ash in the hearth. Lord Julian Thorne stood and raised his glass, a small, enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "To the heir of Blackwood," he murmured, his dry wit replaced by a genuine, quiet awe. It seems the Sterling eyes were simply waiting for the right light to show their true color. Honoria rose, her violet dress rustling with a frantic, undignified energy. She did not speak. She could not. The social murder she had attempted had been turned upon her, and she was now the phantom in a house that had found its soul. She swept from the room, her departure marked by the unmistakable chill of disgrace, leaving the three of them, the father, the mother, and the son, in the amber glow of a new dawn. The grand dinner was cleared away by servants whose movements were now infused with a sudden reverent efficiency. The heavy silver and the crystal were returned to their velvet-lined cases, and the high clerestory windows reflected the deep, bruised purple of the late-night sky. The grand hall, once a tomb of frozen traditions, now felt like a living vessel, its limestone walls absorbing the warmth of a fire that was no longer just for show. Arthur James Sterling led Elara and Leo away from the oppressive scale of the great room and into the intimate quietude of the library. Here the air smelled of cedar, old leather, and the ink of the Vance ledger, the scent of a labor that had finally reached its conclusion. Mrs. Martha Gable had seen to it that a small private table was set by the hearth, away from the draughts and the ghosts of the upper galleries. There were no footmen here, only a simple hearty soup, fresh bread, and the soft rhythmic crackle of the wood fire. They sat together, the three of them forming a circle of warmth in the vast, darkened library. For the first time in 6 years, Elara felt the iron wire around her heart begin to uncoil. She looked at the Sterling family ring on her finger, the unrefined sapphire glowing in the firelight like a small blue star. It was no longer a hidden memento of a lost summer. It was a physical anchor, a promise that the precisely shaped silence of her life had finally been broken. Leo sat between them, his silver-grey eyes moving from his father to his mother. He reached for a bowl of soup, his movements still cautious, still marked by the habit of a child who had never known the safety of a permanent home. He looked at the Duke, his tilt of the head so perfectly Sterling that Arthur felt a lump of suppressed grief and joy form in his throat. "Is this our meal?" Father Leo asked, his voice small but clear, the word father tasting new and strange in the quiet air. Arthur James Sterling leaned forward, his scarred face softened by a tenderness that Elara had not seen since the forest chapel. He reached out and touched Leo's hand, his fingers covering the boy's small ones with a protective foundational weight. "It is, Leo," Arthur whispered, his voice steady and full of a quiet, restorative power. "This is not leftovers, and it is not a debt of service. It is your seat at the table, and I give you my word, as a Sterling and as your father. You will never have to ask for what someone else didn't finish again. From this night forward, everything in this house, from the stones of the foundation to the water in the stream, belongs to you. You are seen, my son. You are witnessed, and you are home." Leo took a bite of the bread, his small frame finally beginning to relax against the cushions. He looked at Elara, and for the first time, the hollows beneath his cheekbones did not look like the work of hunger, but the shadows of a deep, contented quiet. Elara reached across the table and took Arthur's hand, their fingers interlocking over the leather-bound spine of the Vance ledger. The accounts were balanced, the history was mended, and the bones of the thing were finally set in a shape that could hold the light. The library doors were closed, the heavy mahogany panels shutting out the cold draughts of the corridors. The candles burned low, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows against the rows of ancient books. Outside, the winter wind continued to rattle the sash windows, but inside, the depth of their quiet was no longer a freezing void. It was the warmth of a life being restored, one page, one meal, and one truth at a time. Arthur, Elara, and Leo sat in the blue hour of their new beginning. Three souls who had navigated the darkness to find that the loudest truths are often spoken in the quietest rooms. She had spent a lifetime learning how to hide in the shadows. Now she stood in the ordinary light, finally witnessed. "Tell me, have you ever felt the peace of being truly seen by someone who saw through the ruins of your life to the gold hidden beneath? Where is the sanctuary you are building tonight? And from which corner of the world are you listening as the long winter of Blackwood Manor finally turns toward the spring? Share your own story of restoration with me below.